Hackathon 2025 and this talk today, Securing the Data in the GenAI Era, Tackling Shadow AI and Dark Data. We have today Brian Hileman, Director of Solutions Engineering at Cyberhaven with 10 plus years in data protection, creator of DLPtest.com, a trust resource for evaluating DLP capabilities. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate it. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. I have to be patient with the clicker, I was told, so I'm not going to jump through all my slides. All right, so today what we're going to be talking about, like we mentioned in the topic here, we're going to be talking about shadow AI and dark data. If you're not familiar with those, we'll dive into them and talk about what they are, why they matter, why they're new risks that we all should be caring about. But before I jump in and start talking about those new items, the place I like to start is actually, we hear about generative AI a ton, right? We're always hearing about the topic. We're always like, yeah, we should be paying attention to it. So one of the things I like to actually start with is understanding, understanding how quickly AI is on the rise, right? And one of the topics that I like to talk about, which is one of the bigger vendors, is ChatGPT. And if you look at ChatGPT, like just the growth that it's had in such a short time period is actually pretty remarkable when you think about how fast it's got to, well, first off, getting to just over 100 million users in like less than about a year after it was launched is first off incredible. But then look at it today, right? We've got about 700 weekly active users on ChatGPT. So this is not just like a small tech anymore, right? This is being used by a massive amount of the general population out there. And one of the things that I like to look at is also how rapidly it's changing. And the reason I like to talk about how rapidly generative AI is talking is because this will actually lead into one of our first risks around shadow AI. And when I say shadow AI, right, it's more like, think about all the different apps that are popping up and how do we keep track of those. So if you look at, like, for an example, what I'm showing here is just from 2024 to 2025, and what were the most common applications that were being used based on a weekly active users. You could see a lot of change in the applications year over year. And the reason that's important is because if you look at this in just the top 10, sure, you can kind of keep track of it, right? We can all keep track of 10 of these, right? But if you start looking at like the bigger picture, and if I look at the top 50, when I started looking at this list of the top 50 most common apps used up until today, actually this report was about last month, I started looking at this list, and I don't know about you, but like I don't recognize a lot of these. Do you guys recognize these? I probably literally only recognize like 10 of them, maybe. Definitely knew Hugging Face, even though Hugging Face isn't necessarily a GenAI model, it's more of like a repository. But anyway, these are like the most common ones that are in the category of GenAI, right? And the reason this is interesting is because if you think you know what people are using, you may not. You simply may not. Like, this is rapidly changing. These apps are popping up rapidly. There's actually a pretty interesting commentary I heard on a podcast I really like, Hard Fork, and they were talking to, like, they do a lot of interviews, and one of the things that I found remarkable is they had an investor on. He was talking about his prediction is, he says by the end of this year, I don't know if it's going to happen, but by the end of next year, we probably will see a company worth $1 billion, and they're going to have one employee. He said, this is literally the world we're moving into, is where you could have one employee and a company worth $1 billion. That's pretty incredible to think about how transformative this technology has been also to the startup world and how quickly these apps are going to pop up. So one thing that you'll notice wasn't on the top 10, I'm pretty bummed about this. I don't know how many Swiftie fans are out there, but Swiftie GPT was not on it. So any Swifties out there, you're not doing your part. You need to go to the app and you need to start asking more Taylor Swift questions. Come on. All right. Another thing that I like to point out is like talking about who's using this, right? So I looked at some surveys, and I actually found the Salesforce one pretty interesting. It started looking at different countries that are using data, generative AI data applications, and you know this is somewhat aligned with what I figured at from at least the population standpoint. But the one that really stood out to me was actually the bottom stat, that 75% of generative AI users are millennials or Gen Z. I barely made the cut. I'm an older millennial, but I'm in the group, and I say I use it. I definitely do every day, right? And the reason this I think is important is because if you start thinking about the next workforce that's going to be joining your organization, so the people that are in college right now, they are using this every single day. So when they're coming into the workforce now, they're going to have an expectation for what they have been learning and what they've been utilizing, because it optimizes the way that they work, the way that they study, the way that they interact with the world has now been transformed. So I think that it's good to understand that stat, because you can assume that 3 out of 4 people that you hire that are coming out of college, they're going to want to have a generative AI tool available to them. That's just going to be an expectation, because that's the world that they know. And that's the stat that actually stood out here that was most impactful on the Salesforce study. There's some other stats I'm going to go through and talk about. And I work for a company, Cyberhaven. We're a vendor in the data security space. So some of these stats are actually going to be from us, and this is one of them, the first one that I like to use. And really what this chart's showing is we essentially have an agent. It collects data, understands data movement, and we can collect that data and anonymize it and do awesome studies like this. And what it can start showing is how users are interacting with data over time. So you can see this graph literally starts in 2023, which you start thinking about it, you're like, oh, that's actually not that long ago, right? And we had very little use back then, very little. And now if you look at the events over 100,000 employees from a generation standpoint, the growth has been exponential just coming up into early this year. And what I'd like to point out is actually something a little bit different with the way that people interact with the data. Before, the way that we would think about, like, okay, data security, data protection, keeping data protected was like, okay, people are going to upload a file, we could do content inspection on it, and if it had protective data, we could stop it, right? Well, a lot of people aren't uploading full files anymore into generative AI, right? They're actually taking maybe a subset of data, maybe a snippet of code, or a paragraph out of a sensitive document, or maybe some stats out of a financial report. And that's why the thing that's interesting here is you can see we have 2 different lines, and one of the line is copying data from AI apps as well. So it's both sending and now taking data and bringing it back into your organization. We'll get into why that can become interesting here in a moment. So let's talk about our first risk. The first new risk that I like to talk about is shadow AI. Shadow AI, like I kind of explained, is the concept of people bringing in a new app that you're unaware of. So if you think about like Gen 1 of shadow data was actually shadow IT. We've all heard that term probably. That was like when people were going out and they were using either their personal webmail or their personal cloud service or a SaaS application that was procured through a single department, not through the IT team. So that was like the first version now. This is the next version of this, but now it's even easier for someone to just lay down their credit card, or even better, a lot of this is now just free. Like there are free models all over the place that you can just go use, free websites. A lot of this you can just go use at any given time. You don't have to set it down an account. You don't have to put your credit card down anymore. So the one thing that I like to start with is probably the top 3 Gen AI apps that we have here in the US. So we have ChatGPT, Gemini, and Claude. And really what we started looking at from a research standpoint was who are out of these top three, are people using these in work, using their corporate account, like Gemini, right? Are you logging in with your Google Workspace account and then using Gemini? Well, it turns out not very many, right? 95% of people using Gemini are using a @Gmail account, right? Which actually makes sense. There's billions of Gmail accounts out there. People are always there's less corporate Google Workspace customers than there are, something like Office 365. So that stat starts making sense. And then some of them that are actually interesting to me is Claude and ChatGPT actually have more corporate usage than what we saw with Gemini. So that was actually pretty interesting to look at that stat. The first shadow one that I'm going to talk about, besides the personal corporate one that I just did, is actually DeepSeek. And DeepSeek's interesting, the way that you looked at DeepSeek. So if you're not aware of DeepSeek, DeepSeek was this lightweight model that came out of China. Not many people even knew it was being developed. It was pretty under wraps. We didn't even know, a lot of researchers in the US didn't even know that China was building something this capable. So when it was released, kind of caught everyone off guard. Didn't really know it was coming, didn't know what to do with it. And what we saw was the adoption rate of it actually was faster than Claude and Gemini. It actually popped on the scene, and global use of that model was faster than any other model that we had actually seen, which is actually bad for us. Why is it bad? Well, we didn't know it was coming, and we got a ton of data going into Gemini all of a sudden. And why? Well, it was just like new and exciting, and people wanted to go test it and see what it could do. But the other one was that it actually was lightweight enough that you could actually run it on less processing power than some of the bigger models. So some people are actually downloading it, running on offline type version locally on their workstations or servers, depending on what you're running. So that's part of this activity. Wasn't necessarily that it was always DeepSeek running up in the cloud. It also included downloads, I will say that. So that's part of probably why it grew, is because there was a lot of downloads taking place of it as well. All right, setting the mood, everybody. Sorry, go back one. So one of the things that I also looked at was, sorry. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So the other thing that I like to look at is like, okay, well, why do people use these apps, and why is Shadow IT or Shadow AI pop up? And one of the things you could start thinking of is almost the reverse. Of instead of us worrying about like where it's going to, we can start asking ourselves like, well, why are people going to these apps in the first place? So if they're going to an app and they're asking it a question or it's helping them with something, what are they doing with that data, and then where are they putting it? And the one that stands out the most is webmail to me. And so what's that mean to me? Well, what that means is that people are using these applications to help them write emails, which I don't know about you. I've got an engineer brain. I was not good at English, still am not good at English. I use Grammarly. Uh-oh, my IT team might be listening. That wasn't sanctioned. So guess what? Like Grammarly, when I came to my org, I had to figure out a different way because I was used to using Grammarly. Grammarly is an application that's literally an AI app that helps me with my grammar, because I write like an engineer. I write like a robot. It doesn't come off the right way, right? I want to sound like I'm a, slick, cool, nice guy to talk to, not a robot, right? So I was using this app. I was using Grammarly. So think about it. I typed my engineering robot prompt in the Grammarly. I said, hey, make this sound cool, make it sound pretty. Pops it out. I copy that, and then I put it into my email. So that is actually the #1 use that we were seeing. We were literally seeing people going to Shadow AI apps, helping them write an email, and then they took that content and put it back into a message body. So what's that tell me? That tells me people are using this as a helper for things like grammar, things for responding to emails. Another one we saw is people sending the data then into like cloud sharing sites or into corporate messaging like Slack, Teams, Zoom, And then we also saw a big chunk, about 10%, into source code management. Well, why is that interesting? Well, if you're talking about shadow AI here, so we have not procured this, but people are going out and they're using source code, or they're using generative AI to write source code, how do you think that they probably got that initial data in there? They probably didn't type it. They probably literally copied a segment of your source code, your sensitive source code, in there first, and then said, like, help me debug this, help me figure out what this code is doing. And so if we're seeing people take it from generative AI into a source code repository, we want to make sure we understand what apps they're using, right? So what are some of these risks? Well, I kind of just talked about one with that source code type use case. So some other ones, and the most obvious one here is sensitive data going into public models. There was a news report about a user at Samsung that had actually uploaded some sensitive data into one of the generative AI sites, and then actually some malicious users of that actually tricked essentially the tool to spit out that intellectual property. And then they traced it back to the user that actually uploaded it from the first place. So why do I talk about that story? You have to understand, if you're using the free version of a lot of these models, the data that you put into it now becomes public data. Now, can you easily get that out? Not always, but if you are targeting someone specific, like a competitor, if a competitor of Samsung knows what they want to know, what their new product is that they're working on, and you ask it a direct question, it's like, oh, well, yeah, I know that. Like, I've got some knowledge here about a product that Samsung's working on. Check it out. Here's all the schematics and everything that I have about it. And so that's an example of why you wouldn't want sensitive data going in. The other one is misinformation and hallucinations. So I kind of talked about this one a little bit with the source code use case. So if you think about the aspect of it, like writing source code in an AI app that you don't trust, that you didn't sanction, what if it starts putting bugs or backdoors or vulnerabilities into your code that even your scanners aren't looking for, right? Maybe there's 0 days, literally, right? And if you're allowing that to happen, now you've just added some misinformation in that sense. Another one that I like to talk about here is, and we'll kind of talk about this more with the dark data and go into why this can happen. But if you're trusting the source of it, so let's say you go to ChatGPT and you ask it a question, and it brings something back. It is very good at making its answer sound 100% confident. That's like the thing that it's actually very good at. If you ever ask that thing a question and it blatantly tells you the wrong answer, you wouldn't know that unless you literally know that answer off the top of your head. Why? Because these models were literally trained, these AI, the chatbots especially, were trained to be extra confident. Like, don't know why they have that in their dynamic, but they just do, and it's scary. And so the hallucinations are definitely out there. And then the last one is inconsistent customer experience. Great example of this one. There was an airline that actually was using an AI chatbot on their webpage. It was supposed to help with customer service, right? Got an issue. I need to change my seat. I missed my flight. Can you help me with X, Y, and Z? Well, someone figured out, like, this chatbot was there to please people. Well, guess what they figured out? What's going to make me happy is if you sell me a ticket for $1. And it was like, well, it's the only way this guy's going to be happy. So it sold them tickets for like some round trip around the world for like $1. It was like $5,000 of first class tickets. And so the guy that got the ticket, he's thrilled, right? But that led to them being on the news, and then all of a sudden, like, if it was the opposite, if the chatbot, was behaving in the wrong manner, like pissing people off, then again, you're going to have that inconsistent customer behavior. So the one of the things that was learned about that was actually a bot that was purchased just by a marketing team that manages the web page. It didn't actually go through thorough testing, didn't go through like IT and security. Like that's the problem with these tools, is like you can literally just like buy a little chatbot for your web page and you're like, yeah, it's fine. But like if it doesn't go through the proper channels and doesn't have any testing done against it, you could end up giving away literally money. So let's talk about the other risk I like to mention. The other risk is dark data. So what am I talking about when I say dark data? Really, the idea of dark data is we have two different types of data that are being used. Oops, this slide was supposed to, I forgot that this one had a build out on it. I don't like build outs when I'm doing talks. Oh no. Oh no. Okay. All right. So you've got essentially active data. So active data is like the data we're working with day to day. So I don't know about you though, but we move through data pretty quickly now. And also the cost of storing data has gone down significantly. In Office 365, you can store a lot of data. You just simply can, right? So people will either create data, or they'll create duplicates of data, or they'll create a file literally for each month of the quarter for a report, and then that just starts to stack up. So the data you're actively working with, pretty straightforward. The dark data is really like that forgotten data, the data that is no longer being used, it's harder to find, and it just may not be needed anymore, and we'll get into why that might become of interest. So some examples. I like to throw out examples because this one is actually, at first for me, I was like, I'm still not following it. Like, what are some actual examples? So the first one I like to talk about is like interactions. So think about like that chatbot I was just talking about. Like a lot of people have chatbots everywhere. And that chatbot actually usually keeps a history of every single chat interaction it has, and it just dumps it into some data lake somewhere, right? But it's not necessarily, do we need that? I don't know. Did people put in their bank account number? Did they put in their PII data? We don't know. We're just dumping it all someplace, right? Also think about like Slack and Teams. Man, that is millions of messages that are being sent every day, and those are all being archived. Like the corporate versions of these apps, they just store it for I don't even know. Slack, I'm searching messages back like 5-6 years old, like at this point, right? I'm sure it goes even further than that, right? Raw survey data. So I don't know about you, but like we ask our customers surveys about new products. What's of their interest? What do they care about, right? And we use that data. That's another example. You use that data for a snapshot in time, but then we typically don't delete it. So we're getting feedback. Another one is call records. How many of you guys have note takers on all your calls now? I sure do. I got one. I also am on the vendor side, so I bring my note taker, and most of you guys are like, kick your note taker out. Get him out of here. So my note taker and me have a hard relationship. I boot him out of the calls a lot. And so that's another one, right? We got call recordings now. We also have things like financial data. Like financial data, again, is relevant at a point in time, but then we just store it forever. Email correspondence, old documents, notes, presentations. The other one we don't think about a lot is like IoT data. So I don't know about you, but I've got one of these vacuums bouncing along my walls right now, probably pissing my dog off because I'm not home, wondering where I'm at, wondering why I'm not protecting him from the vacuum. And so that thing's collecting data, right? It's literally collecting data about how long it ran, what's its battery life, what it needs its filter changed, right? But this is across millions of devices, and this is just the consumer side of things. Think about in the field, right? I live in Colorado. You know, when I think about like some stuff that goes on here industry-wise, I think about like oil and gas, right? And then I think about like all the IoT devices and everything that's sitting out in the field, getting data around production data, going into a big database and big data lake. And those might be interesting from like a historical reporting standpoint, but it's a lot of data. We're just dumping it, right, into big databases. Another one I like to talk about, geolocation data, and then also surveillance data, right? Video data, like, again, like we record our physical security as well, usually like DVRs, and nowadays that's just dumped again into some sort of large data lake where we're storing all of this. So one of the things that I wanted to look at was like, okay, so we've got a ton of dark data out there. How much is it, right? So there was a study that by the end of this year, IDC estimates that we'll have 175 zettabytes. And I'm reminding myself on my notes, I said how many zeros that is, and I can't remember now. But it's a lot. That's a lot of data. I'm going to put it on the slide next time so I can remember. It's like 20 zeros or something wild, right? And what's interesting about this is 80% of this is going to be unstructured now. So think about that. Back not that long ago, when we started thinking about data that we were collecting, a big data was all around like structured data. It was like a database, an SQL database, Oracle database. We were collecting data, we were putting it into fields, and we knew what that data was, and it was going into some sort of structured manner, right? This has all changed now, right? 80% of that's going to be unstructured now. And generative AI is actually going to make this even faster. It's going to create more unstructured data than what we've ever seen. That's the prediction, right? And then 90% of it, and this is from Forbes, and 90 seems a little high, but I'm going to go with it for the shock factor, will be never analyzed. 90% will be never analyzed. Well, that just seems like a waste, right? Like, why are we even collecting it? And if we are, like, should we be collecting it? I don't know, right? Okay. So what's some of the risk? One risk that I like to talk about around this is first off, compliance, regulatory, privacy. One of them I talked about was like customer interactions, right? So if you're having customer interactions, let's say that chatbot, I talked about it being on an airline, but imagine you run a bank or a credit union, and you get that same type of bot on your site. And people go to that bot every single day and they say like, here's my account number, tell me my balance. And it's just like, well, I wasn't supposed to get your account number, but I have it now, so let's just dump that into the database. Oh, well, right? So that's an example of now all of a sudden you have a chatbot that's collecting bank account numbers and dumping it onto cloud, and okay, like there's a new compliance risk that we weren't thinking about before, right? Another one is a lot of people use Microsoft. Nothing against them. The AI of theirs is Copilot. I haven't really talked about them, but I will say like Copilot's been a new approach of people saying like, okay, it's our first way of getting gently into AI. The interesting thing I find about Copilot is it's like, well, I'm just going to train it on all your data. Just let me go wild. I'll scan all of your OneDrive, all of your SharePoint, all of it from the beginning of time. And it's like, okay. And then you ask it, and so then you train it, and you're like, okay, go wild, Copilot. And then you ask it like, a question like, hey, what's our revenue predictions for next year? And it gets confused, and it looks back on like, 2019 data, and it's like, well, I'm going to calculate that maybe next year you'll make about $2 million. And then you jump that into a PowerPoint, and then you go present it, and people are like, you mean like $2 million a day? That's our quarter prediction? What's happening? Chaos erupts, and you're in trouble, right? So unreliable data, if you're training it with old stuff, like you're going to get garbage in, garbage out. And that's kind of the risk of doing a closed model, is you do actually have to make sure you're training it with the correct data. If you're using something like and we'll talk about it, actually, the next slide talks about it. If you're using like an open model, something like Gemini or Claude, these are more trained on like the whole world's worth of data, right? And then you can also train it with your own data, so then it can give you like a flavor of kind of both. But there's a new risk that gets introduced with those, and there's this cool tool. I like this tool. It's called Glean. It's an enterprise search tool. I don't know about you, but I've got like 15 or 20 apps that I use here at my company, and I've got my product data over here, and I've got my internal GitHub over here, and I've got Confluence, and then I got Notion, and then I've got, I don't even know, Jira. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like the sprawl of data is massive now, right? We have so many different places the data's in. Something like a Glean is like, well, I'm an enterprise search tool. I can actually scan all of that, and I can bring it back into something logical the problem with that is, what about access control? There was actually like a use case where it can scan your HR data. Can you get it where that might be going? Well, you scan your HR data, including your salary information, including your CEO's salary, and if you're publicly traded, not as big deal, but if you're private, that could be a big deal, right? And then, some gruntled worker like hops onto Glean's like, how much money does a CEO make? And it pops it out, and it's like, oh, that's terrible. I want to make that much, whatever, bitching on Reddit, next step, I don't know. But the problem is access control is what I want to get to, right? So that can be the problem, is the lack of access control can really be the problem there. All right, so let's talk about mitigating some of these risks. So we talked about shadow IT. Let's start there. Let's start talking about how we can actually mitigate some of these risks. So one of the first stats and one of the first places I started with today was I talked about how millennials, which if there's millennials still going to college, you've been in there a little while. I don't know why you're still there, but that's okay. That's beyond the point. The new generation, Gen Z, whatever's next, that next generation coming in, they're going to be using AI tools. And so if you work in an organization and they walk in and you're like, nope, we don't allow it at all. There is no AI allowed in this company. Guess what's going to happen? They're going to find a way to get to it, right? And if you're blocking the big models, Claude, ChatGPT, the ones that are just obvious, you can do probably a URL blocking, guess what they're going to find then? Remember that top 50 I showed you? That top 50 is more like a top 1,000 or 1,500. So they're going to find one. It's just going to be even more shady than the big ones, right? So let's just go down the shady trail until we find one that is not blocked by the URL filter, and now they're using shady one that we have no idea where it's hosted, right? So they will find a way to it. So what's the recommendation? It's pretty simple. Give them a tool, right? Give someone either a pro version of ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini, or if it's Copilot, it's Copilot. But at least give them something, right? And I get this question a lot, and I'll just address it up front. Can I trust them, right? Look, your DPA and your legal agreement with those companies is your legal team's job, and they are being used because ChatGPT's revenue with business customers is elevating every single quarter. So people are trusting this. There's no way that organizations are actually signing on without having the correct DPA in place. I'm not a lawyer. I'm sure you guys have much better lawyers than I do. So that's more of a lawyer question than what I'm going to answer, right? And then what about beyond that? So the next thing I think about is like, okay, if I need to solve shadow AI, what do I need to do first? Oh, I need to know that it's happening. So you've got to start with visibility. You have to get some sort of visibility that this activity is happening inside of your environment. And really, there's really three main ways that I've seen. There's probably others, right? But first off is DLP and an insider risk agent, so something sitting out the device, looking at data, both what I mentioned is like file uploads and copy paste, right? Another one is a browser extension. Go out on the vendor floor, you'll see enterprise browser companies as a new category, and they usually have browser extensions as well, so they can see what's happening inside the browser. And then, of course, you could always go to your proxy or your firewall. We still all have SASE solutions nowadays, right? So at least getting visibility, that's step one, right? And then we move into step 3 and 4 here. And now we need to say, like, okay, if we want to resolve it, so we start with visibility, and let's say we gave them a professional version of ChatGPT. I'm just going to use that for the use case here. What I then need to do is I need to be able to educate my workforce on their behavior and potentially point them to the correct tool. So let's take this example, right? We've got a developer. He's working with source code, and he copies some sensitive source code from our corporate GitHub repository, and then he pastes it over into a public model. At that point, I want to prompt the user through either a real-time prompt message, Slack message, email, whatever that may be, and I want to tell the user, hey, I see that you just sent that out to the public. We actually have a pro version of ChatGPT. Please use that instead. So you go through the education phase first of telling them like, hey, you did this, do this instead. And then if they're still not listening, you need to be able to block it, right? And when I say block, I like the idea of a controlled block. And what do I mean by that? Instead of just outright saying like, oh yeah, we're just going to use a URL filter and we're going to block all GenAI, well, why not be more specific? Like you should be demanding of your tools to be able to say like, if it is sensitive data going into a public model, then I want to block it. You shouldn't have to use the hammer approach, in my opinion. Tools are smart enough nowadays, they should be able to understand what is sensitive and classified data and then prevent that from being uploaded, not do the hammer of just block it all, because you're just going to literally play whack-a-mole, and I don't think you're going to win this race. Okay. Let's talk about solving the dark data. So we got 4 on that one as well, maybe. All right, so first off, with the dark data use case, and the one I like to start with is I mentioned how much data is going to be unstructured. So back when we started doing data classification, it was actually somewhat easy when I first got into the data security space. We wrote regexes for social security numbers, regexes for credit cards with LUN checks, and keywords and dictionaries, and it was actually fairly easy, right? PII data, PCI data, HIPAA data, like it was actually somewhat structured. There's patterns involved. Like we could actually classify it fairly easy. But now we're moving to the unstructured, and like that slide showed, like most organizations are creating unstructured data now. So how do you actually classify that? Well, the new data security vendors in this space, they actually have, and the term that you'll hear a lot of them using is DSPM. That's kind of the hot term that's being used. They all have created AI classification mechanisms that actually can understand data that is unstructured and put it into categories or buckets of understanding what that data is and determine, like, is it corporate, is it sensitive, is it personal? And so those tools actually can be utilized to classify your unstructured data. So if you know what that data is, then you can treat it differently depending if it's classified or not. Next is visibility. So I talked about visibility with the first use case. If we talk about visibility here, it's essentially just getting visibility of who's using dark data. Like, just want to understand, like, is someone taking a bunch of our dark data, whether that be sensitive dark data or unsensitive? Got to do step 1 to understand if it's sensitive, though. You know, if you're trying to understand, if someone's just taking data and you don't know if it's sensitive or not, that's a problem. But once you have that data classification in place, then understanding how people are using it. Same thing, DLP, EDR, SIM, access logs. If you want to go old school, you can do it that way. Understanding who's using it, who's accessing it. And then we talk about the last 2 is really, one is like, consider archiving your data, especially like that Copilot use case I was talking about, right? Like, or if you are going to do it, like, don't trade it all the way back on everything that's always existed. Probably focus on more the relevant data, the active data that we talked about. Consider archiving your data. Another use case that we're seeing with a lot of these vendors as well is like helping you deduplicate data. So like, it's just so easy. Think about OneDrive, Google Drive. Like, you go to a file, you literally hit create copy, and then you're working on a new version of that. Think about how often that happens. It happens a lot. So your data is just replicated all over the place, and you may not need replications everywhere, right? So there's deduplication you can do there as well. And then the last one I like to talk about is, like, I talked about that, the chatbot, right? Asking for or taking in account numbers or social security numbers, or like literally, you know, not doing what it's supposed to be doing, going rogue. Instead of letting it go rogue, maybe let this security team that we see out here, maybe you guys should get the first swing at that thing, right? Do some red testing. Make sure that thing's not going to just take anything in. And if it does, either respond back like, hey, you can't send me bank account numbers, or, you know, finding a better tool, or if it does take those in, sanitize that data so it can't actually go into your databases. So that's actually it for today. That fairly short talk for you guys, but I will open it up for any questions that the group has.
Yeah, so you talked about Gen AI and the way that people feed data into them, and you were talking about also filtering that data or providing a pop-up to the user stating, hey, you entered source code that is not, and we have a private Gen AI model that you can use for your corporate environment, right? So my question is, who's going to be doing that analysis on that initial input of source code? Because if it's the actual vendor of the Gen AI, let's say ChatGPT, and they were to analyze that code, isn't it still going to have that same problem of collecting data and archiving it and storing it? So is the approach to have a separate AI model to analyze the input, or is there some other form of security that we can place on top of these Gen AI models?
Yeah, so really the way I think about it is if it's a public model, you need to prevent sensitive data from even getting there in the first place. So you need a mechanism in place, and I didn't plant this, gentleman, but I will say, like, this is literally what my Cyberhaven does. Like, this is what our company does. We specialize, we endpoint agent, we specialize in understanding what is sensitive data. How do we do that? We understand the context of what data is and the content. We can get to the content, but content's a little less relevant when you think about source code. Source code, I don't really care like that it's JavaScript. We know it's JavaScript, right? What I more care about, did it come from our sensitive company repo out of GitHub? Did that developer run a git clone command, and now they've got that source code sitting down locally on their workstation. Now they open it with VB Studio, they copy it, and then they paste it into ChatGPT, and it's not their corporate account, it's their personal account. That moment needs to be blocked. And the reason it needs to be blocked is because you need to be able to trace that data back to the original Git clone out of the company GitHub repository. Does that make sense? You need to prevent it from even getting in there. Now, if it's a pro model, so let's say you paid for the ChatGPT Pro model, we actually use that as a company. I have a pro account of ChatGPT. We have a zero retention policy in place with ChatGPT, meaning if I ask it a question, they have said in their policy and in their contract with us that they will not use that data. It's zero retention. So when you say like, and I do this sometimes, I'll write a script and it's buggy and I'll be like, hey man, help me out, I'm terrible at coding. And it's like, oh yeah, you didn't literally know anything you're doing. Let's start from scratch. It'll literally, then it doesn't, that new script that it helped me build, that does not go into their training model. That's zero retention. Correct, yeah, and if you have the free account, assume that it's now public. So you need to prevent it from even getting into that model to begin with. Yeah, and I didn't put this gentleman here. No one blame me. Vendor neutral, right? Yeah, no problem. Great question. Any other questions? All right, well, I appreciate everyone's time. Have a great day. Thank you.